Okay, welcome. A couple of weeks ago, we were with Jesus and the 11 on that Thursday evening as they walked past the Temple Mount complex, and they noticed that great big beautiful vine on the front of the temple. But from there, we went out to the countryside to an actual vineyard and talked more about I am the vine, you are the branches. Today, we're going to go back to that Thursday evening, and actually just a little bit before that, and talk more about some of the events of Holy Week, particularly the Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. So we're going to pull up those slides for you, and then we're off to the old city of Jerusalem. Okay, so we are here. As we mentioned at that time, the Last Supper on Thursday evening was probably in this area here of the old city, right in here. Then they walked past the Temple Mount complex and noted that vine on the temple. So in AD 70, the Romans destroyed all of these buildings on the Temple Mount. This was all turned to rubble, and today the spot here is occupied by the Dome of the Rock with the Golden Dome. The one thing that's left from the Temple of Jesus Day are these steps right here, the south steps of the temple. There was an entrance and an exit that went actually underground, came up through these little openings into the temple courtyards. And those steps have survived. So we're going to visit those for just a moment. Here we go. You can see here the original steps from the time of Jesus, and then some reconstructed steps. This is that south face of the Temple Mount. There were a couple of doors that led up through the wall and up into the temple grounds. The Mount of Olives in the far distance here across the Kidron Valley. Shout out here to James Martin, our tour guide. And you can see again the Mount of Olives in the far distance, and we're standing on those steps. These are the mikvaot, or ritual baths, where the believers at the time of Jesus would have come to wash or cleanse on their way to the temple. These mikvaot, or ritual baths, are also very likely the location for the baptisms of Pentecost Sunday, 50 days later, Acts chapter 2. So from the Temple Mount, we're going to go across that Kidron Valley. Or maybe I should so. So from here, you cross the Kidron Valley and go up onto the Mount of Olives. So that's where we're going to go next. We have crossed the Kidron Valley. We're up on the Mount of Olives, and we're going to enter the Garden of Gethsemane, a small piece of the Mount of Olives set aside to remember Jesus' time of prayer there on that late Thursday evening so long ago. This little piece of the garden is very lovingly tended and very beautiful. It's under the care of the Franciscans, as we've seen so many times in the Holy Land. Very, very ancient olive trees. Not sure if they go back exactly fully to the time of Jesus, but very ancient and very carefully and lovingly tended, this small garden here. That is the exterior of the Church of All Nations. You may have heard that the Mount of Olives was covered with olive trees, no surprise, and the Garden of Gethsemane is part of the Mount of Olives. Gethsemane means olive press, where the olives were crushed and pressed to bring out the precious oil, and many people have observed the fittingness of that for Jesus' final prayer in this garden on that Thursday evening, as he was pressed and squeezed and troubled by what was before him. It pressed from him some very sharp cries and prayers. The garden is right there that we were in. This church here commemorating Jesus' final prayer. You can see the disciples sleeping and Jesus at prayer. It's known as the Church of All Nations, but it's the commemorate Jesus' final prayer. An inscription here, you may have expected an inscription from the Gospels. It's actually an inscription from the book of Hebrews, chapter 5, where it's noted, in the days of his flesh, he offered up prayers and supplications with strong crying and tears. This is Hebrews 5, verse 7. With strong crying and tears unto him that was able to save him out of death, and he was heard in that he feared. In the days of his flesh he offered up prayers and supplications with strong crying and tears. A very appropriate inscription actually for this church commemorating that moment in the life of Jesus on that Thursday evening. We're going to go inside. Inside has deliberately been left quite dark. You can see the night sky with the stars in the sky. It's been deliberately left quite dark because it was a nighttime scene. Jesus was praying at night, and he also did say this is the hour of darkness. So this is purposely dark inside to remember that very difficult moment in Jesus' time, in his life. We've come back out now. There's that little garden, the Church of All Nations, and we're looking across the Kidron Valley to the Mount of Olives. You can see there's still a lot of natural olive trees growing here, and also a lot of grave sites. Apparently, already before the time of Jesus, and the Jewish believers felt that the Mount of Olives was going to be a critical place in the final days, in the Last Judgment and the breaking in of the new world. And so they liked the idea of being buried on the Mount of Olives. Later, of course, Christians wanted also to be buried on the Mount of Olives, to be in the front row, as it were, when Christ returns. So the thought being that since he ascended from the Mount of Olives, he would return to the Mount of Olives. So it's a very solid wall of graves all over that side of the Mount of Olives. We are now walking the Via Dolorosa. This is a very early Friday morning. The Via Dolorosa, the Way of Sorrows, starting at the judgment hall of Pilate, where Pilate turned him over, Jesus over, to be crucified, and then that long walk to Golgotha in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. This happens to be the 6th station of the cross as we walk that Via Dolorosa from the place of judgment and flagellation to the place of crucifixion and then ultimately resurrection. Give credit here to Jim Martin, who has studied and then commissioned the artist to give us some visual depictions of what crucifixion would have looked like in those days. I'll say more about crucifixion after I get to the next slide. Crucifixion had a number of different meanings in the Roman world. The public meaning was, we are in charge here, you are not, and if you cross us, this is what will happen to you. That was a very public proclamation, which is why they tended to crucify people on a main thoroughfare just outside the city walls, and usually up on a hill, to make this very public proclamation, we are in charge here, do not cross us. It was also very intentional in terms of how they treated the victim. Crucifixion was intended to be, number one, very painful, and number two, very shameful. It was meant to heap shame on the victim, and then thirdly, intended to be very prolonged, and so that the suffering would be prolonged, and no relief even of death. Well, the final 5 stations of the cross are inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. This is the exterior of the church. You can see this is a large and rambling building, first built by Constantine's mother Helena when she came to the Holy Land around 330 AD. And then many times over the years destroyed by earthquake and rebuilt, destroyed by invaders and then rebuilt, and then added to, and then crumbling with age and then rebuilt. So it's a giant old rambling building. Gives you a little sense of the size of the entrance there. And inside, very, very easy to get lost because it, as I say, a very rambling building. Now, you may recall from the Gospel of John, chapter 19, that when Jesus had died on the cross, it says there was a garden nearby with a tomb in which no one had been laid. Yes, nearby indeed, because this single rambling building covers what's left of Golgotha and what's left of the empty tomb. And so it's those two were indeed very close. A lot has changed since the time of Jesus' time. For one thing, the city was expanded, so what used to be outside the city walls is now inside the city walls, which means it's very built up around here, and it's a very bustling place. But this is almost certainly the location of Golgotha and of the empty tomb. Hard to get a sense of what it would have looked like in the first century at the Holy Church of the Holy Sepulchre because of the busyness. So there's a considerable merit in making a little journey outside of the Holy City, outside of the old city of Jerusalem, to what we call the Garden Tomb, which was probably not the actual location, but is a better place to meditate and contemplate. A very ancient tomb, and it's empty, and on the doorway, "He is not here, for he has risen," as he said. The tomb that Jesus was laid in was the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, and it's interesting when you read in the Gospel of John, 19, verse 41, tells us that the tomb and the cross were very close by. Mark 15:43 is also interesting. Mark 15:43 tells us that Joseph of Arimathea dared to go to Pilate, or he was bold to go to Pilate and ask for the body. And then it says that Pilate was surprised that Jesus was already expired because, as I said earlier, this was intended to be prolonged. So Pilate was surprised that Jesus was already dead. We are not surprised because we know that he was carrying on his shoulders the weight of the world. And we also know that Jesus had chosen the place of his death. It had to be Jerusalem. He made that clear. He had chosen the method, which was lifting up. When I be lifted up, will draw all men to myself. And he had chosen the timing during Passover week, the great festival of redemption, when the Passover lambs were being slain. So it is not surprising to us then that he actually chose the particular moment of his giving of his life. He cried out, "It is finished. Father, into your hands I commend my spirit," in control all the way even through his death. And looking forward to, of course, resurrection on Easter Sunday morning. Just a little bit more about Joseph of Arimathea. It says Joseph dared to go to Pilate. And you know that Jesus, though innocent, died the death of a bandit, of a revolutionary, and it was crucifixion was intended to heap shame, among other things. So for someone like Joseph, very upper class individual. To go and ask for the body was to identify himself with that person, and to give an honorable burial is then to begin to reverse that shame, and it's to risk being associated with that person who died as a criminal. So you see the courage of Joseph, but you also learn that Pilate did not really believe that Jesus was a revolutionary or a bandit. And he had been boxed in by the religious leaders, but he himself knew that Jesus was innocent of the charges that had been brought against him. And so a beautiful moment to sit here and to remember. And thank you for joining us. We're going to drop those slides a moment. And okay. Okay, well, that gives us a lot of food for thought. Again, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you again hopefully next week. Okay. Okay, and